How's it going, guys? This is J Sweels Hard Out at you. I'm back again with another video. Today I'm going to be talking about language learning applications, primarily the ones I've used, of course. And I'm going to talk about how my views have changed. This is kind of a follow-up of one of my last videos talking about how I'm changing my learning methods. And of course my views of these apps are now changed because I've started this new method. But I'm going to give my thoughts on a few applications, kind of like a review or comparison and contrast. But anyways, so this is kind of, I'm going to try and go through it app by app, and haven't really planned this video. This is kind of spur of the moment. But anyways, I'm going to talk about these apps and whether I think they're good or bad. Now, one thing I'm going to note is this is my experience in learning Indonesian. Primarily I've used one of the apps I'm going to talk about is Duolingo and Babbel, and or I guess it's two apps, but most of the apps I've used for Indonesian. And Indonesian isn't as popular of a language to learn as Spanish, which is the newer language I've been trying to learn. And because of that, a lot of apps are going to be better fitted for learning Spanish rather than Indonesian. So kind of take everything I say with a grain of salt, and I'm not saying don't try these applications because depending on the language you're learning, it might be a better fit for you. But I'm primarily going to be talking about my experience in learning Indonesian on these apps, and I'll talk about, for the ones that I have studied Spanish on, I'll talk about as well, because I don't want to just overlook that as well. But the first app I'm going to talk about is probably one that all of you already know, which is Duolingo. And Duolingo, if you've been in the language learning community for any amount of time, you know that Duolingo kind of gets mixed reviews, and a lot of people make fun of it. And the reason is because Duolingo, people always joke about the sentences it gives you, just these things that we would never say in real life. And I agree, you're not going to get much use out of that in terms of being able to use it in a conversation, but I'm going to come back to that later. So I'm going to talk about Duolingo, Babbel, and just a few other apps that I've used. And then I'm also going to talk about LingQ as well, which is the newer one and the latest one I've been using. But back to Duolingo. So Duolingo, if by any way you don't know about it, it's just a gamified language learning app in which you go on there and you can test out of the course in certain parts. If you already have knowledge in the language you're wanting to learn, you can kind of get a boost. But assuming you're starting from scratch, then basically it's going to start you from the very basics of the language. So if you're learning, say, Turkish, it's going to start teaching you pronouns and basic verbs and things like that. And so it's going to pretty much get you started, speaking even just a little bit, even if it's just basic things. Duolingo was probably the first language app I used when I started learning Indonesian, because it's just one of the first ones that came up. And here's where I'm going to talk about it. And keep in mind, this is before I've changed my mind on some things, and even before I changed my mind into doing a more immersive, comprehensive input approach. Back then I was probably more in line with people who say, speak early, and that's just because I didn't know any other method. But pretty much starting in Indonesian, I started doing the course, and Indonesian was a good language to get started on. I had tried Spanish just a little bit before, not seriously, but pretty much I'm trying to think. So pretty much what I did was just I started knocking out the very basics of the language. I was learning your basic pronouns like saya, which is I, mereka, which is they, and things like that. Then I was also learning, your basic phrases like terima kasih, which is thank you, and just all these things like that are going to be usually the first things you learn in a language, just your basic conversational words that you're going to use the most. And here's where I will say Duolingo is good, is if you have no clue about a language, it really is, I think, just a decent way to get started. So I'm going to veer off the topic just for a minute. So I tried studying a little Portuguese the other day just because, I've studied it a little bit before and I knew it's similar to Spanish, and one of my friends was wanting me to learn some or try and speak some. But anyways, I started trying to learn some Portuguese, and so I tried using LingQ, which is what I've been using lately, to try and see how much I could learn from it in just a short amount of time. And I was starting off in a bad position. When I say I studied Portuguese before, it wasn't that much. I didn't make it very far into it, but I could recognize some basic stuff. But when I started trying to read, even some of the basic articles or whatever you call it, I didn't understand. So I wanted to refresh my memory, go back to Duolingo, try and progress a little further in the skill tree or whatever you would want to call it. And even that, it was enough to get me to where I was starting to it's a hard word for me to say, comfortably read more in Portuguese, just because I was starting to understand some of these basic articles. Then my knowledge of Spanish, while it's little, was enough to kind of help me get through these stories, pick up more words and vocabulary, So Duolingo, my point is, and other people I know would agree with me, is a good way to get started. And here's where I'm going to try and defend Duolingo a little bit. So like I was saying, people tend to get on its back because it gives you all these sentences. But I will say, I think that even if the sentences aren't something you're going to use any in your conversation, there, that is something that other apps don't have, which is teaching you words in context. So I'm going to use this as a bridge into the next app that I want to talk about. And like I said, keep in mind, I'm talking about Indonesian. I don't know how the other courses are on Babbel for like Spanish, French, whichever language. Babbel, beforehand, I would have really defended it. I would have really stuck up for it. And to me, back then, it was one of the greatest language learning apps for me. But now I really don't think so, and I'm going to explain why. So I've seen people praise Babbel more than Duolingo, which I can understand because, Babbel on Indonesian has like these basic courses which are to help you get used to the grammar, the sentence structure, and things like that. But here's where I think Babbel has flaws. So I will go ahead and say I didn't get through all of those just because by the time I bought a subscription to Babbel and was getting into it, I was starting to learn more from, the other apps I was using. But anyways, Babbel, the flaw with it that had me thinking it's not as good as I once thought it was. Sorry, having coughs in my throat, but the thing that had me thinking that it wasn't as good as I once thought it was is I started taking a look at their way of teaching you vocabulary, because Babbel, it had a lot of just these like categories of vocabulary, like I'm making stuff up like fruits and vegetables, or things around the house or things like that. And while that's good, it's good, it can be good to learn in a categorical method if you're wanting just to get a basic knowledge of how to say the most common animal names or the most common pieces of furniture you're going to have in your house, like couch, bed, things like that. But and obviously those aren't going to be as hard to know how to use in a sentence. Not hard to know, oh, I'm going to use the word apple, like I eat an apple or something like that. But where it did become problematic for me was when I started learning like certain words, where it would give you kind of like a one word or general definition of it. But I was like, well, I don't know how to explain it because words can have multiple meanings, and also it's kind of confusing because I didn't have a good idea of how the affixal system of Indonesian worked, if that's the right word for it. So that kind of made it a little harder. But, I think that's one of the worst ways you can learn vocabulary. I'm not saying don't do it, but if all you're doing is just learning words out of context, out of sentences, that can be hard to know how to use it then if you don't already have a pretty good idea of how the language works, especially in my case back then, the grammar. And, I just found that to be inefficient, and the more I slacked at using Babbel, which obviously that's an error on my part, but the more I slacked at using Babbel, the more I'd have these large stockpiles of, words that I'd have to go through and review. So Babbel, one of its things was it had a spatial repetition system. I think it's the right phrase for it, which is basically where it just quizzes you or has you review words on a set time period. So one word I would review it, and then because of their system, I might not see it for however much longer. And I'm not saying that's a bad thing, but in my case, if you missed a few days on Babbel, then you would have to just, especially if it was multiple days at a time, where you're starting to get like hundreds of words, piled up, then not the only way to kind of get back on track, I feel, is just to go through it, take the time, and just work all the way back through and get your due reviews back to zero. And I just found that to be ineffective for me. Of course, I did learn some from it, but it was out of context, And, it doesn't. Another thing, too, I'm not trying to say grammar is the most important thing, but, with the affixal system of Indonesian, it would teach me a word that would have some of these affixes. And, there would be a root word in the center, but I wouldn't notice that. And so I feel like that could be a point where they could do better to explain how some of these affixes work, and maybe it's just part where I didn't make it to in like their kind of more guided study. But I'm in the middle on Babbel, if not just a little below the middle, and I'd have to try it in other languages. I'm sure some courses like Spanish might be a little better, but and that's another thing. Duolingo, like, same thing for Indonesian. Like it wasn't as kitted out, or it didn't have as much resources for Indonesian as it did Spanish, where Spanish has like more interactive lessons, stories, and I know they can't do that for every language. I'm sure it takes more effort, of course. So another app I'm gonna talk about is HelloTalk, and if you've watched my podcast, you probably know how much I've really praised HelloTalk for being a good language learning app, and I still do. But this is where I'm kind of changing my view. So it worked out all right for me with Indonesian, because Indonesians, they generally have a decent level at English. Usually they're the ones carrying the conversation, and a lot of conversations have been in English just because my Indonesian level still isn't very close to fluency. It's better, but it's not where I want it still. But pretty much HelloTalk, it's a really good app for what it does, which is practicing. And of course, there are some drawbacks, which I can talk about in a minute. But HelloTalk, if you don't know, it's a language exchange app. There's other apps kind of like, I think, like maybe Tandem as well, and things like that. iTalki, which is kind of more tutoring based, but you can do the same thing. And HelloTalk is just it's pretty much you go on there, you make friends, meet people, and pretty much have a language exchange where you talk to each other in your target languages. And it's a really good app because it's just really interactive, and it's getting better moment by moment. They just put out a new update recently, which I think had some good features on it. But anyways, I will say I'm not going to put now, the way I view it, if I were to start a new language now, it wouldn't be my first place to go. And the reason is, now my method or my view of learning languages is more of a reading and listening focused method, at least at first, not so much of a speaking first or early on method like some people teach.